Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, March 28th, 1979, at 4 a.m. Eastern Time, a pump stopped working and sending water to the steam generators that removed heat from the reactor core at the 3 Mile Island Nuclear Generating Station, which is located near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Operators in the control room reacted poorly because of missteps and misinformation, and by early morning, the core had heated to over 4,000 degrees, just 1,000 degrees short of a full-on nuclear meltdown. On the 7-point International Nuclear Event Scale, the partial meltdown at 3 Mile Island was rated a 5, which is, quote, an accident with wider consequences. Those consequences, we'll get into it, but were to some extent environmental and health related, but to a much larger extent about the narrative surrounding nuclear power. That really is the legacy of 3 Mile Island, is the way that it changed the conversation around nuclear energy in that moment. So here to discuss, as always, is Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So, Niki, let's talk a little bit about just the TikTok of this event and specifically kind of how this event played out in terms of a communication, people finding out about it. So what do we need to know?
All right. So you gave a really great description of all of the little things that went wrong that led to this kind of catastrophic moment. And that's one of the wild things about reading about this is how small the errors were that led to what was almost a nuclear meltdown. But, it takes a while internally to figure out what's happening. And then the communication to government bodies is a little muddled. So it is no surprise that when they start communicating with the public about what's happening, that you're getting a lot of competing messages. So those messages include initially saying, it's all right. No big deal. There aren't any health and safety consequences from this. There have been some problems within the nuclear facility, but everything's okay. And then as things unfold, as they learn more, they discover this hydrogen bubble that's within the nuclear reactor that could potentially explode. Big problem. And so they start changing their advice. They tell people to stay indoors. And then a little later, they say that pregnant women and preschool-age children should leave the area. And that leads to a kind of panic. And about 40% of the people in the area leave during this time because they're terrified of some kind of radiation poisoning or nuclear explosion.
Yeah, you read the TikTok of it, and I mean, it is, and I'm not sure if people have seen the series Chernobyl, but, that was such a masterful look at sort of all the small decisions that go into this and the miscommunication. In that case, I think it was, trying to downplay something that was genuinely catastrophic. In this case, I think it was really just a misstep of messaging and sort of flailing between, oh, this is nothing, and, oh my gosh, maybe people should evacuate, and, the public will generally glom onto the worst, the scariest scenario when there's a sort of missteps in communication. Kellie, this eventually, no surprise, makes its way to the White House, and Jimmy Carter starts to be aware of this. What's his reaction?
Well, Jimmy Carter's frustrated because, he gets his staff all together. They turn on the TVs. They're watching, the major networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, and they're all giving different information. There's no sort of streamlined process of information. There's no general consensus about what is really taking place. And so Carter realizes this lack of consensus is what's causing the confusion, and not just consensus, but a lack of correct information around what's happening is what's causing confusion. When Niki said that 40% of the town leaves, that's about 100,000 people who are headed on the road all at the same time. So you can imagine, the kind of panic that's taking place. And so Carter realizes that he has to intervene. He has to step in to give people calm and peace of mind about what has taken place and what are the next steps.
And so a couple of days later, on the 31st, he actually goes and pays a personal visit to Harrisburg and sort of inspects it. And by that point, there had been some evidence of a radiation leak, which caused more panic. But, it was also, I think, people were starting to realize that a major crisis had been averted at that point. Niki Carter is interesting in that he's like kind of the perfect person for the job, which is a thing that unfortunately we rarely say about Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy Carter had a lot to commend him to the presidency, and in particular to this moment. He just mishandled so much of it. He had studied nuclear power when he was in the military, and so he was somebody who knew exactly what he was looking at when he was going into this facility. So he goes into the facility, he feels perfectly safe, and he kind of looks around and he's like, oh, I kind of see what's happening here. This isn't as bad as I thought that it was going to be, because he has that knowledge, but he also doesn't want to overly comfort the public. He does say that he found it perfectly safe, that the levels of radiation had been monitored. He was kind of showing in the same way that, like, we watch presidents get vaccines, or we watch them put themselves in places where there has been danger. It was kind of his way of saying, it's safe enough for the president. They wouldn't let me come here if it was a radiation hazard. And so it was kind of his way of comforting the people, which they really needed, because a lot of the news coverage was focusing on what was so scary about what had happened.
Yeah. But he was literally had trained as a nuclear engineer. He worked on an atomic submarine. He had helped dismantle a damaged Canadian nuclear reactor while he was in the Navy. So, he probably could have rolled up his sleeves and maybe even gotten in there.
And how many
he probably wanted
can
to
do that?
Yeah.
That's so impressive. I think we've talked on, past episodes. I feel like Jimmy Carter's always getting thrown under the bus in a lot of ways. But this is a moment where I think he got to take his expertise and really shine and instill confidence in the people around him and the people that are watching this.
So that's a good sort of segue to get into this larger narrative that emerges. We should say that from a health perspective, this was certainly, the reports that this was an hour shy or so of a proper nuclear meltdown. Maybe Chernobyl-esque. I'm a little out of my element here, but something like that. But this was shy of that for sure. And I think over time it was learned that yes, there were radiation leaks, but cancer levels in the area over time have not been elevated. I think a genuine health disaster was avoided. But as a narrative, this was, I think, an unequivocal disaster, Kellie. And I'm curious why you think it was that this played out that way.
I mean, part of it is what we had talked about before. There was no real understanding or consensus about how bad it could be or what the long-term effects will be. People are still not sure about whether they would come back. And then getting this all cleaned up, that's an expensive effort as well. This is not an easy fix. So when they started the cleanup in August of 1979, they didn't really end cleaning up the site until almost 20 years later, December of 1993. It cost about $1 billion to repair all of the harm that had been done with this nuclear reactor. So, I mean, it shows you that these instances are not cheap or short term. I think that's the best way to put it, that the consequences for this aren't something that you're going to have solutions to in a week or even in a couple of months.
And I think that gets at some of the fears about this. Like, nuclear spills are really, really difficult to deal with. And remember that 1979, you're talking about like 30 years of Americans fearing nuclear power. Yeah. They're scared of nuclear weapons. They've been reading comic books about how radiation will turn you into a Spider-Man or will have this kind of cellular level effect. And Americans have been sold to a certain extent on the ability of nuclear power to be harnessed and to provide this kind of clean energy, but they're still scared of the thing inside the reactor because it's difficult to understand and its effects can be so alarming, right? And so it's no wonder that, in the few years after this, you see this massive anti-nuclear movement that, even though it's against nuclear weapons, it sort of sweeps up nuclear power as well as part of a kind of more cohesive anti-nuclear move.
I think it's also scary because this is not something where the next day you develop boils, right? Or the next day, you see physical ramifications of what has taken place. Sometimes it takes years to see the effects of those consequences. And so people were always terrified that, maybe I won't get cancer tomorrow, but in 5 years, is this related? And that's right. A big deal.
Yeah, and certainly, there are environmental effects and health effects from other types of power and poisoning Absolutely. And so forth that that don't take a long time to show up. But I think this was something that was new, and I think this conflation of nuclear weapons and nuclear power is really fascinating. And I think a lot of nuclear advocates would argue that that's an unfair conflation, and that nuclear power is much stable or safer. But I see this as in many ways a story about kind of how we view risk and how we think of risk. And often when something has a deeply catastrophic downside, we tend to focus on that, even if it is very rare. And one catastrophic incident sort of makes us pay more attention than a sort of whole slew of mid-level disasters as we see in other types of power and so forth. And so, and then as you were saying, Niki, the environmental movement picks this up in this interesting way. And I think that tide is maybe starting to turn a little bit, but it's always been a conversation within the environmental movement to be anti-nuclear or really see it as a genuine renewable energy. But do you think this really kind of sunk the notion of the United States being a country that relies in a real way on nuclear power?
I do. I think that 3 Mile Island looms so large in the public imagination. I even thought, I have to say, that not knowing a ton about it, I thought that it was a much more catastrophic event than it actually turned out to be. So I think that in the public imagination, 3 Mile Island is America's Chernobyl, and it does turn people away from nuclear power as a viable option. And of course, there's a lot of lobbying from other power industries that are trying to push that message. But I think I do think that this was a turning point moment.
It's the canary in the coal mine in a lot of sense, in that it compels other places, other plants, to look at what's happening and are we shored up? Is our communication on point? Is everything in working operation? I think that had this not happened in Harrisburg, it definitely could have happened anywhere else. And that's what causes people to have a little bit more vigilance about this kind of work.
I will say I didn't realize that 3 Mile Island was actually still up and running. They shut down the reactor that had the meltdown, but they keep the other one up and running. And it actually has just recently had to close down, but it closed down not because of anti-nuclear activism or anything like that, but that because the price of natural gas was so cheap that they were no longer competitive economically, which was a fascinating twist to the story.
All right. Okay, well, let's leave it there. Listeners, if you come away with anything from this, it is to now say to yourself, Jimmy Carter, nuclear engineer. Just add that to the end of his name from now on.
Peanut
furnishing
farmer
his reputation.
Peanut farmer / nuclear engineer. There you go, yes. Kellie Carter Jackson, thanks to you as always.
My pleasure.
And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Thanks to everyone who gets in touch with questions, comments, potential topics. You can email us, thisdaypod@gmail.com. There is also a contact form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Abergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
It happened at the number 2 generator about 4 o'clock this morning. Something caused the secondary cooling system to fail. It shut off the reactor, but heat and pressure built up and some radioactive steam escaped into the building housing the reactor and eventually out into the plant and the air.
Radiotopia.